I feel really under a cloud following Peter. I can't. I struggle to make this stuff funny, and there was a time probably when it was new to me that it might have been more funny. But as time goes on, I think I've lost my sense of humor about it. So I apologize. It's my fault. Okay. But I thought there are some aspects of this new book stuff that would be interesting to you folks in particular. Yesterday, I heard quite a bit of discussion about the status of theory in media studies. And I thought instead of constantly looking at yourself, you might be interested in looking at a different discipline that really privileges theory, economics. And it believes that it deals with many of the same topics that you guys deal with. Okay, so it might interest you to see what they've done with some of these topics. So I see that as kind of my job here today. But also to give you a different perspective on a couple of your concerns. So for example, there was also a discussion of a lot of the anti-humanist trend in social theory yesterday. I think, you need to see it really set in. And so I mean to try to suggest that happens today. And then Wendy Chun yesterday said, kind of offhand, theory doesn't give answers to political questions. Well, I think what you'll see is that for the economists, both the neoliberals and the neoclassicals, I'll come back to that, that for them, that's just the natural order of things, that theory does give us political guidance. So those are the things that I would like to talk about. It seems to me, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, that media studies has not paid very much attention to the economists in talking about a lot of these issues, both about information and about cybernetics, all those sorts of things. And the economists, of course, believe that they have been masters of this since the 1970s, 1980s. So you really should have a sense that they believe themselves to be very much experts in this field. And the attempt to tell that story, it's already been mentioned, is this new book that's coming out from Oxford with Eddie Nick Ka, The Knowledge We Have Lost in Information. So that's what I'm going to summarize. First thing that I notice here is that there is this tendency every once in a while to have a kind of a technological determinism in the sense that, the technology of experience with computers, with the internet and so forth produces social effect X, okay? Well, what's interesting about the history of the economics of information is that it didn't have a whole lot to do with the rise of the internet, or at least its origins, and for a long time. So that's going to already creates an interesting problem for the technological determinist story. It actually dates back to the 1930s or 1940s. It just slightly predates the development of the electronic digital computer. So I'm not saying that it was born, sprung fully blown from the head of Athena, but it really was, that's where we're going to see where the beginning is. And it addressed a problem that I think has been central to the neoclassical. Please don't worry if you don't know what that is. It's basically the orthodoxy, pretty much, that's taught in microeconomics, okay? This orthodoxy, neoclassical microeconomics, has not really been structured to handle mental cognition, memory. Matter of fact, almost all cognitive phenomena. One reason for that is, hint, hint, it was an imitation of 19th century energy physics, so they didn't care about any of that stuff. But moreover, it's sort of hard to sort of lever that into the story as we get closer to the present. So that's a real problem for the economists, that they want to, in some sense, they want to talk about mind, sort of, but they don't really, because they don't want to talk about cognition, they don't want to talk about memory, so forth and so on. So that's why information is so fascinating. It's their way of trying to have it both ways. Okay. Also, this raises another interesting issue as soon as we start talking about information, is how smart is Homo economicus? This is rarely talked about. Actually, this is a very tense issue in the profession. And it's a very simple question. Is the agent, in other words, you, as smart as the economist? Are you smarter than the economist? Or are you stupider than the economist? Now, again, you think, well, does this really matter? Yeah, it matters a whole lot as to what's the role of the economist in the story that they're telling. And it actually shows up that way a number of times. And then finally, there's the question which addresses neoliberalism, which is, can economists know more than the market knows? Because that, again, creates a problem. I mean, there's this entity which is superior. All right. Now, the idea that economists just discovered the importance of knowledge around 1950 is implausible, although it's the story that the economists like to tell about themselves. They like to say, oh, we didn't pay any attention, then, some important people woke up, like Ken Arrow and so forth. And all of a sudden, whoa, information, right? Well, what's interesting to me is somebody in communication studies, Dan Schiller, who some of you may have heard of, actually wrote, more than a quarter century ago, why is the status of info a major topic in economic theory, and why wasn't it in 1700, 1800, or 1900? Why was it only in the post-war period that the economic role and value of information took on such palpable importance? See, okay, so that's a good historian's question, right? It's not there, all of a sudden it's there, what are the determinants? The way that the economists tell the story is just that they're all responsible for it, right? We realized it was important, and so we just piled in and came up with our theories. In fact, by and large, and I'm skipping over a whole lot here, that's not true. That much of what is talked about as the economics of information actually comes from other places, and I'm going to hint where they come from, okay? And also, the second way that they tell the story is that it's been successful. That whatever, it's now the dominant story, it's how we explain society, so forth and so on. And that's also a problem, as I'll try to suggest here. All right, to save time, you all know this part. This part is the rise of Shannon information theory, and there are lots of good histories about this, so I actually am just going to skip this here, except that I'm sure you all know that in the late 30s and early 40s, Shannon, out of cryptanalysis, comes up with this idea about information, and that it spreads dramatically and rapidly to almost all the social sciences in the immediate post-war period. Okay, I mean, that's just a given. So what's interesting about that is the economists don't acknowledge that, even though it becomes very important for them. That it actually shows up in a bunch of other social sciences, but peaks and kind of goes away. And the economists, with a little lag, pick it up and try to make something of it. Now, here is where I have to make a distinction, and I know it's not a distinction not often made among people who aren't historians. That there's a difference between neoclassical economics, which is the orthodoxy, which is what you would get in introductory micro course, and neoliberal economics. Neoclassical economics goes back to the 1870s. It was this physics imitation, so forth. It's the maximization of utility, all that stuff, okay? Neoliberal economics only begins in the 1930s and 1940s. So that's the first thing you need to know, that they start off being separate. And the person who is most associated with the beginning of neoliberal economics is Friedrich Hayek. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. But the important point about him is that, in a sense, he is the first acknowledged economist to want to elevate information to the central theoretical role in economics. There really isn't anybody before him, but there's this other thing about him, that he's an outsider, all right? He's not really in favor of the orthodoxy, even back then, okay? So people haven't paid, I think, enough attention to this, although if any of you know any people who are in the Austrian school, they all have been saying this a million years. So, it's just that they don't get heard by sort of more conventional historians, that's all. Basically, by around 1945, Hayek, and not just Hayek, I don't want to make this a great person story either. There really is a whole neoliberal thought collective in the Mont Pelerin Society that's responsible for this, but I can't do everything here. So it's really a group. I'm using him as just a marker for the group. He conducts or concocts a cognitive economics. The most important point that I would hope you would get from this is early on, he argues that the market is not an allocation device, which is the way it's thought of in neoclassical theory. You know, there's some stuff over there, you know, I want it. You've got some stuff that you don't want. We got to get together somehow. That's allocation story, okay? This story, Hayek's story, is that allocation is not the central role of the market at all. The central role of the market is cognitive. No one had argued this prior to the 1930s. I would hope that this might be of some meaning to you, that no one had argued that before. He argues this. It's interesting to speculate where it comes from. I won't do that here. But it is important to see what this looks like, because by the 50s, this takes on a very interesting shape. It rejects correspondence theory of truth. It has a kind of a model of the brain, and it is interesting where this comes from. His model of the brain actually is a projection of his model of capital theory. Wow, now you begin to, I just think that's so cool, that somehow the brain works like capital works. You see, which is much more plausible to him, anyway. Prices embody all relevant knowledge. I'll come back to that. See, that actually is a much earlier doctrine than I think people realize. It only sort of infiltrates the orthodox neoclassicism by the 70s or something like that, okay? I thought you guys would enjoy this. He goes on and on, ranks on and on against German thought. Historical knowledge is a category mistake. It's a German sickness. That's his term, actually. So he hates German thought, and he sees this as a counter move to German thought, which is also interesting. And it becomes cashed out slowly as a kind of a more simple person's version, which is that there is a marketplace of ideas. Anytime you hear someone discussing the marketplace of ideas, basically, whether they know it or not, they are spouting pure neoliberal doctrine. I thought you guys might find that useful. Maybe. Here's a little quote from him, just so that you can see that. By the way, this is a famous quote. It appears in all kinds of histories. Everyone knows that this is the point where it sort of enters the consciousness of economists. I won't read the whole thing, just the latter half. The peculiar character of the problem of a rational economic order is determined precisely by the fact that the knowledge of circumstances of which we make use never exists in a concentrated or integrated form, but solely as dispersed bits. Now, this is kind of doubly interesting, right? Because first you think he might be referring to bits, but he's not, and I'll come back to this. He's really thinking here of an ontology of knowledge as a kind of stuff. You know, I think of it kind of like pixie dust. It's hard to pick up. It's all over the place. You know, so knowledge really is a kind of stuff. Incomplete and frequently contradictory, which all the separate individuals possess. The economic problem of society is thus not merely a problem of how to allocate given resources. It is a problem of utilization of knowledge which is not given to anyone in its totality. So you see, it really becomes the market becomes an epistemological machine. Now, let's look at the neoclassicals briefly around the same time. They have, by that time, they're famous. They all say that they don't want to have anything to do with psychology. It's not like today where they claim they do but don't. Back then, they say, no, we don't want to have anything to do with psychology at all. And yet, they constantly say that their theory presumes perfect knowledge. So there's this very strange straddle that they were trying to live back then, which is really probably untenable. Okay? So basically what they wanted to do was they wanted to keep their old price theory while addressing the challenge of Hayek. Now you might think this is a little odd. If he's an outsider, why are they so inclined to want to address him? And this is one of the most interesting things I think of the history, is that all the people in the orthodoxy who are later responsible for building models of information in orthodox economics all say that they're responding to Hayek. So there's a politics at the heart of this. And what is that politics? Illustrating that theory has politics in it, but leads to politics as well. The way that Hayek understood his doctrine of the marketplace of ideas, or that a market is an information processor, is that it's a more powerful information processor than anything else known to man. I can't stress this enough. The market is smarter than you. It's smarter than everyone. There's nothing you can do about it. Now, if that's true, don't you see that this is immediately the three-line refutation of socialism? If the market's smarter than everybody, anyone who wants to run things has overweening pride, doesn't understand, and is bound to come to sadness. Okay? So, why are all these neoclassicals opposed to him? Because early on in this post-war period, a lot of the neoclassicals think of themselves as socialists. I know, this is totally confusing, but I'm not going to explain it here. But they think they're socialists. So they find this as one of the major intellectual challenges of their time to kind of refute this guy in some sense. Okay? But here's where it gets interesting. How are they going to refute this guy? Well, they're going to blind him with science, because that's how you do neoclassical economics, right? You always appeal to science, you appeal to technique. And so what they do is they look over to the natural sciences to give them hints as to how they should model information and work it into their pre-existing theory. Okay? What's interesting is there's not one, but three options that are explored roughly in the period 55 to, 1990. Okay? One is information as though it were a thing. Literally a thing, like strawberries. Right? It's something that you can divide up, sell, buy. And you see, in some sense, they think that Shannon information theory underwrites that. Now, I'm sure you guys all know that that's crazy, but that's not the point. The point is they see this as a new future of treating information as a thing. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Secondly, there's a group that wants to look at information as an inductive index, or for those of you who know some philosophy, as an epistemic logic. Not that the economists were philosophers, forget it. It's just that, again, a number of people at RAND, actually, in the operations research department, told them, here's how we're going to, set up the problem. And basically, information is a partition over a pre-existing state space. All right? And so they're going to explore that, too. And then finally, information as explicit computationalism. Turing machine, Turing tests, so forth. Mental states as computational states. This, interestingly enough, is the least developed of the three, and I'm going to come back to that too. But there is some inroad of this into the attempt to model information. Now, here's the point that I want to get across with this. Information depends crucially on how it's modeled, because one kind of information cannot be reduced to another kind of information in any serious way. So this is not indifferent at all. I mean, you really commit to certain theoretical principles when you commit to one of these notions. So if information is a thing, cognition is irrelevant. Did you ever think about that? Because you just buy it. Who has to think? All right? Learning is the purchase of a commodity. Communication is the same as exchange. You see? However, if information was a Blackwell inductive index instead, David Blackbell is one of the mathematicians that they steal this from, then cognition is intuitive statistics, or epistemic logic. Learning is, of course, statistical inference, and communication is signaling. By the way, I want to stress to you that each of these still exist, even though I'm going to describe a historical trajectory of the profession shortly. Each of these still exists. And this middle notion of information is central to the way big data is theorized today. All right? So it's not like these go away. They also move out into other areas. Now, what instead if information has to do with symbolic computation? Then cognition is symbol manipulation. Something closer to AI, really. one form of AI. Learning is the augmentation of algorithms, and communication is the transmission of these algorithms. Okay. Here's the story, really quick. Basically, there are a group of economists at a place called the Coles Commission, which turns out to be central to high theory, at least in America, that explore each of these models, and they tend to explore them sequentially. In other words, at first, they're really attracted to the thing-like model. They find some drawbacks to that, and by the way, they're pretty serious, actually. Then they get all worked up about this Bayesian inductive inference. This is when they get kind of all thrilled with game theory. It comes tied up with game theory because the Nash equilibrium itself involves a Bayesian component. And then finally, they do, or some subset of them, explore symbolic computation. But what's really, so there's a temporal aspect to this. It starts off with the simplest one, and then it moves through the others through time. I'm not saying anyone has ever totally given up. They are like the simple, dumb, thing-like notion is actually a very Chicago school notion, like Gary Becker's human capital is the thing-like notion. So some subset never gives it up, but these guys move through. But the other thing that's interesting about them is they follow Hayek in his own trajectory through thinking about how knowledge is going to be used or information is going to be used in a neoliberal way of thinking. So first, they start thinking about information as though it's only local, and that's what the market has to fix, right? The market takes the local and makes it global. But then, in the middle of his life, Hayek decides, no, that's not quite right. Some information is present in human beings that the human beings themselves cannot access. So that problem is the problem of tacit knowledge. And that problem, of course, is that they have a story that the market can get at that in the way that you can't. And then that wasn't good enough. Towards the end of his life, I would argue that Hayek believed that whatever you thought was basically irrelevant to what happened. And the odd thing that I'm going to claim is that the economists follow this trajectory too. They start off thinking about it as at least something that you can access to something that's increasingly inaccessible. Now, I know that the terms won't mean a lot to you, but this is my attempt to give you a kind of a diagrammatic expression of what happens to information from, let's say, 1950 to the present. Okay? And it has two axes. One axis, you'll see the vertical axis is the different types of information, with thing-like being at the bottom, moving up through computation. And the horizontal axis is agents, thoughts, matter, and then progressively matter less and less, being, for example, tacit, somewhat inaccessible, and then not. Hayek actually argues that there's information that exists in the world that no one knows, and only the market can find. And slowly, this becomes an idea that seeps into orthodox economics as well. All right? So that's the argument of this diagram, is that basically that's what happens. What happens in the profession is that the profession moves in the upward northeast direction in that quadrant, okay, through time. Economists respond to developments in the natural sciences. That's part of the reason. And this is back to the ahumanism. There's a movement away from believing that agent self-awareness makes a difference. Do you see how anti-humanism shows up in economics? Is that it doesn't matter what you think, at least for the purposes of the theory. Okay? The profession itself becomes increasingly neoliberal, and as it becomes increasingly neoliberal, it solves problems by doing what? By building markets to convey information where somehow there's been a failure. And see, so what we've moved, and by the way, see, that's why I think you guys should not appeal to Adam Smith and the invisible hand anymore. That's not the story anymore. The story has changed dramatically from one where there's a monolithic market that economists, somehow worship, which is the way you guys tend to think about it, and the idea of multiple markets, all of which are information processors, which do things that human beings cannot do. Okay? And so what we've gotten rid of is we've gotten rid of a monolithic view of a generic market. It's true, it's what you're taught when you have economics 1, but see, what I'm trying to convey to you is that at least at the level of research, that's gone. People don't believe in that so much anymore. That they argue now that regulators should reconfigure markets, in particular with regard to short-term political controversies. In other words, the way to solve a political controversy is to build a market, all right? And usually that's bound up with privatizing something, but see, not necessarily, because the whole idea is that the market is the perfect information processor. And of course, there's no questioning at all that the market could, in some sense, be stupid. There's no way an economist can talk about a stupid market currently. No, this is very interesting, isn't it? It's a total reversal of seeing the agent as brilliant and omnicompetent to seeing the market as omnicompetent and really, in some sense, godlike. So, what am I saying? I'm saying that economists' conceptions of information, as they change in that direction that I've suggested to you, changed how economists conceptualized markets. Can I say that again? Instead of just being a small, minor theoretical change in information theory, it changed what it meant to be a market, especially over 60 or 70 years. And secondly, as they changed their notions of markets, they changed their attitudes towards what's the role of the economist. Back to the story of, are economists smarter or more stupid? Okay. What's the role of economists now? The role of economists is not to simply preach the wonders of the market, as perhaps it might have done earlier. It is to intervene and to make markets do things for their patrons, whether their patrons are private corporations or governments. That's new. Prior to 1980, there was no indication of that in economics at all. You and I live in a different world now. I'm sort of running out of time, but we have a couple of examples of, because we want to make this more concrete. I'm obviously operating at a very abstract level. One of our examples, I don't know if you guys know about this, are the spectrum auctions. The electromagnetic spectra that were sold off for your phones and all the other wonderful wireless devices that you have and so forth. There's a story that the economists tell about this. It's that it used to be that spectrum was inefficiently allocated, and it had all kinds of terrible politics in it. And now in come the economists with their new grand solution, which is to invent special auctions. And these special auctions efficiently allocated these spectra such that governments are doing much better job in terms of media these days. Okay, that's the way they tell the story. I can't do it in detail here, but basically we show that almost every step of that story is wrong. That is that, at least in the United States, the US Congress mandated a bunch of different objectives, not just one. For example, to put a lot of these licenses in the hands of discriminated groups, the Indians, so forth and so on. Also to have the licenses not monopolized, but spread kind of widely throughout the country, so there's competition, all these kind of things. And then they went out and hired some game theorists to invent the auction. And so you would think, oh, okay, game theorists, they all agree. This is the mistake. By the way, this is the mistake of performativity, too, just to make a few more enemies in here. Performativity says economists just go make the world. It doesn't work exactly like that when you look at it. What happens instead is that all these game theorists came up with a bunch of different alternative auctions. None of them agreed with each other, and most of them were hired by the firms that were bidding on the licenses in the first place. And surprise, surprise, their different game theoretic notions were exactly aligned with the strategic interests of the business that hired them. So FTC sees this, says, oh, wait a minute, we don't want to be caught red-handed, favoring one group over another. So they essentially, out of the blue, impose an entirely different kind of auction. See, what's the role of game theory here then? Okay. And in doing so, politically, they forgot all the things that the Congress told them to pay attention to, and instead championed what? Maximum revenue for the government. And there's actually an argument that the version that they fronted didn't even do that. But of course, you know what history's like. Who can tell the difference? Because we can't run this experiment again. So basically, they championed, that's what we're good for. We're good for maximizing revenue. So you see, the economist's role is very strange in all of this. But what's really central is the idea that the markets know more than any participant. And so you have to trust these specially created markets to do this. So, wrapping up. This is a very strange world that we live in now, okay? It's a world where the economists claim to talk in terms of welfare, but in fact, their agents have no cognition, and what they know doesn't matter. So hey, welfare is meaningless. All right. Secondly, even though you all still think it's all about Adam Smith and the market working, in fact, what's happened is that markets as entities have fragmented, even in the theory, into multiple differentiated markets. And what the economist is a person out to make a quick buck to sell you a market to solve your problem. And by the way, that's why economists are on the science side of this academic divide, because they too can sell their expertise. It's very important, right? Third, economists change their status from the high priests of markets to these bricoleurs, because there is no single theory of how to do this, okay? That's the other thing. There are many different theories, as I've just told you. There's no single theory. So they pretend there's a single theory, when in fact there isn't. That's a good trick too, huh? See, that's the answer. The answer is to always have multiple theories, but pretend you have a single theory. That's how you get cultural power. And then finally, there's a deepening of neoliberalism. Everything assumes the trappings of a market, because that's the only way to think. You can't have a thought without a market in a neoliberal world. Okay, that's it.